He sat in an empty room, thinking about what was coming. He knew he was one day going to wake up to this day. It was just another ordinary day for a common man. But for Marcus, it was not. He looked at the clock hung on the wall opposite him. It was 2 p.m. His heart palpitated. Only a couple of hours remained. His feet turned cold, and his mind raced back to 1975, the year when it all happened. It was a warm summer noon in Sheltonopolis, the city of big dreams and opportunities. The streets of the city were always teemed with millions of people, and not everyone residing there was a localite. It was a commercial hub, and people from across the country flocked to the city, carrying a ray of hope in their eyes. But not everyone got lucky. There were some who had come to the city of opportunities to make a million out of a shilling, but ended up on the streets with nothing but a piece of clothing and without a permanent rooftop. Marcus was not new to this place. He had been living here since he was 9 years old, so verily he knew the city like the back of his hand. His father had worked as a carpenter, and the mother was a janitor at college. Marcus was always quiet. As a child, unlike other kids, he wouldn't go around playing and indulging in boyish mischiefs like any normal kid would. His disposition was like that of still water. He used to watch his father work with mallets and axes in their backyard, where logs of wood and sundry other items required in carpentry were scattered all across the ground. Nobody knew what was going on in his head. He was a high school graduate and could not afford to pursue further studies owing to his parents' financial status. But he soon found his way out to live independently. Marcus worked at a grocery store in Sheldonipolis. He was the assistant general manager at the store, and one couldn't say that he was not hardworking. In fact, at times he would put in extra hours of work to avoid going home. It was lonely and there was nobody he would go back to, so he preferred staying late at the store and being kept busy. One evening, as he was driving back home, his eyes fell on a girl who was standing at a bus station. It was late and she seemed to be standing all alone there. No fellow passengers were there to board the bus, it seemed. She was someone in her mid-20s, donning a pair of light blue jeans and a loose tank top to beat the summer heat, and clutching a handbag onto her chest like it possessed something more valuable than her dear life. It was like an instant spark that ignited in him. He did not know who she was, but that was not to last much longer. He pulled his car next to where she was standing and rolled down his window and asked if she wanted a lift. It was weird. He was weird that way. No sane person would ask a stranger if they wanted a lift, and no person in their right minds would agree to accept the offer, especially when it was dark and the person was alone. It was dangerous. There had been various sporadic incidents of crimes in Sheltonopolis. They were mostly youngsters robbing people of their money and stabbing them. Some others involved kidnapping and arson. Crime rates were slowly on the rise, and the people were cautious enough not to step out of their safe havens all alone after dark. But the girl standing there had been waiting for a bus to arrive for over 20 minutes with no luck. She looked at Marcus carefully, tracing his appearance through the window of his car in the dark under the dimly lit skylight. She noticed he was well dressed, had deep blue eyes, and stubble, with haircut cropped up military short. Her careful assessment of him told Marcus that she was probably gauging her option on whether to take the bus or take a lift. After some careful consideration, she agreed to accept the lift. She was not to be blamed. It was past 9 p.m., and the public buses were not that frequent around the time. And to take a walk home was out of question since she lived very far away from her university. Lisa, that was her name. Lisa was pursuing her PhD at the State University, and her frequent jog from library to classes made her a busybody. She was young, attractive, and innocent, with a meek smile. So you're a student, I see. He tried to make small conversation. She nodded. She did not wish to speak to a stranger, although to her he did not pose any threat. Where should I drop you? He asked. He knew where he was headed to. He was attracted to her in a way one could not explain. He wanted her, and he knew it very well. It was her address first and then her heart he was aiming for. Lisa couldn't see through it. There were not too many exchanges of unnecessary words all the while they were in the car. And Marcus, being the clever guy he was, understood it perfectly. It was the idea of trust one had to win first before going for the next move. He dropped her home safe, and she took away a good impression of him with her. It was the first score. In the days that followed, Marcus, with an intent to be seen by her, drove past her house every day. It was at one such moment that she happened to be talking to someone on the streets, and he, taking good advantage of the situation, pretended to bump into her by accident on the footpath. Oh, hey, I didn't hope to come across you. What a pleasant surprise. And that was it. It could either be his gentlemanly demeanor or his good looks that charmed her. Later that day, he asked her out for a cup of coffee, and she readily agreed to join him. What made Marcus different from the rest of the people was his calm and fairly composed disposition, even during the worst adversities. His father was an alcoholic and had abused his mother before they got separated. Marcus was only 7 then. He had seen his father coming home every night stinking of cheap alcohol and hurling abuses at him and his mother for trivial and sometimes no reason. Even then, he remained quiet and left the house with his mother. But nobody knew about him any more than that. What was his past like, his secrets, his side of the story, it all remained shrouded in a veil of mystery. He never let anything out about him to anyone. He was, however, a very good listener. Like he had listened to Lisa when she was talking endlessly about her research paper and her university shenanigans. What about you, Marcus? You haven't spoken about yourself. Tell me about you, Lisa urged. He started talking about himself, albeit in a vague and general kind of way. Lisa observed him as he spoke about his quiet childhood, his abusive father, and how he had very few closely knitted circle of friends. He hardly blinked, and he made constant eye contact while speaking. It was not something she was used to. She, on the other hand, rarely made any eye contact while talking to people, partly because she was shy and partly because it made her uncomfortable. Anyway, that was all she was being fed on by him. Like everyone else, she was not being treated any differently when it came to discussing his past. It was his act of chivalry and decency that made her fall in love with him. It was an organic consequence of his charm and his I can do anything for you personality. The fallout of falling in love with somebody without knowing his or her background doesn't always pan out well for everyone. She was introduced to his ridiculously possessive side weeks after both of them started dating each other. He was outrageously possessive about her. It was claustrophobic to an extent, as she had once told him. You have trust issues, I love you, but you don't have the right to control me at all times, she once burst out at him. It was her saturation point that he was testing, unknowingly. He apologized. He always apologized. And like always, he was forgiven. And every night after an argument, they made wild, atavistic love. It was always less languorous and more like him trying to establish his control over her. There was no apology needed then, and she never tried to stop him. It was a carnal desire that overwhelmed her to the point where she begged him for more. Things were going fine between the two, with spasmodic arguments that became an affair so commonplace that none of them took it seriously. Or maybe she did not. But Marcus was a different man. Nobody knew what was cooking inside his big head. Yes, he had a big head compared to the rest of his body. His big head was always the talk of the town. He was never evocative, and even his portrayal of possessiveness towards his romantic partner was subtle. He would give her a steely cold stare, saying pretty much nothing to her except for occasional cocking of his eyebrows. It was on one Sunday morning that Lisa, picking up the missing thread of her jogging where she had last left it, came across Joe at the Central Park. They chatted casually. Now, you must be wondering who Joe was, but I shall unravel that in some time. Presently, Marcus was watching the two talk from behind a tree. He was not a regular jogger. He had, in fact, never exercised in his life, yet maintained a perfect physique. But there he was, keeping a watchful eye on his girl. No, it was more like spying on her. His possessiveness could hardly be kept at bay, and this was not the first time he had spied on her. Every time she was at her university, he was there, standing outside the premises of the institute, waiting for her, waiting to see if she talked to any fellow male student, or worse, got pally with him. This had hampered his work at the store. Those extra working hours, staying late at work, were no longer his priority. It was Lisa that was on top of his list. But for the next few days, he had been catching her talking with this person, Joe. They, both Lisa and Joe, used to meet outside the park. It was an old building on the 7th Cathedral Street where he had espied her going in several times. And that was where Joe lived. "What did you do today after class?" he asked her casually one evening as they were having their dinner at a famous restaurant in Chiltonopolis. His question was framed to evoke any strange reaction from her. "Oh, nothing in particular. I had stopped by the grocery store to pick up a few items and went straight home. And gosh, I had to write my research methodology for like hours. It was quite taxing." Nothing extraordinary in her mannerism, he noticed. But that evening, he was particularly calm, calmer than his usual self. He smiled. "I see. Well, would you mind spending the night at mine?" He winked. She knew it. The next moment they were seated inside his car and drove away slowly. Marcus had put on the stereo and played Frank Sinatra's "Strangers in the Night." The air was romantic and she loved it. The night was going to be an exciting one, she thought to herself. They both reached his place. She smiled at him, and they both hugged each other. Now Lisa and Marcus were at Marcus's place. They both kissed each other. He took her hand and kissed it. "You're mine," he whispered into her ears, and slowly took her by the hand and led her into his bedroom. "Tonight is the night you shall never forget. I have a surprise for you, honey. You wait here and I'll be back in a minute," Her state of elation knew no bounds. She loved surprises and she couldn't wait to receive one that night. Lisa got up from the bed and walked towards the window and opened it. The summer air was soothing, and she closed her eyes to breathe in the beautiful air of romance that pervaded the night. A hand came from behind her and grabbed her neck. She gasped for air and tried with both hands to get rid of the strong arm that had wrapped around her throat with immense strength. But before she could realize what was happening, another hand made a grab of both her wrists and tied them up together. She screamed in terror. He turned her around to face him. His unfathomable eyes gleamed menacingly and changed color. Diabolical thoughts, evil temptations. Marcus was gripped under the influence of madness. He grabbed her hair, pulled them hard, and leaning towards her face, he whispered, "If you can't be mine, you can't be anyone else's." Lisa was in a state of absolute shock. She had no idea what was happening to her, to him. He dragged her down the stairs and toward the basement, which was dark and reeked of evil. The foul stench was so overpowering that she could barely breathe. Marcus switched on the lights and, with calculative precision, tied her to a wooden chair whose one leg was half broken. His basement was the house of the devil. There were tufts of long hair strewn all over the place. Hair of various colors, brown, black, blonde. There were broken fingernails and dried up bloodstains on the floor and the walls. This macabre sight was not welcoming to her. She sensed fear and death. It was appalling. Marcus had disappeared for a while only to return with an axe. The edge of it reflected under the poor lights of the basement. Lisa turned pale. With the same brutal force as he used to make love to her, he let the axe slice into her plain figure. Her cries had stopped. There was total silence. The blood had spilled on his face and painted his walls red again. He slayed her and later flayed her. His madness was not yet satiated. He took out an empty jar and carefully stored her skin in it. If that was not all, her limbs were cut into pieces and thrown out in the backyard. That only piled up on the dead and decayed limbs of many others. His madness was satiated. His hunger was satisfied. A man wearing a black coat entered the room, waking Marcus up from his web of thoughts. It was his lawyer. "Only an hour remains, Marcus. People have started gathering outside the prison. They are waiting in anticipation to finally get justice after 2 years." Marcus looked at him. A smile ran across his face. A smile that was at once so sad and so cruel. He knew it. He had lost his trials. It was Lisa's family who had filed a missing complaint, and that, as was certain, led the police to him. It was found out that Lisa was not the only victim. He had already had a history of charming ladies with his gentlemanly disposition and later killing them all in the same manner. But nobody had until then found out about the many other young girls he used to lure and trick into trusting him, as they were not the locals of Sheltonopolis, and none had any inkling about them going missing. A conventionally attractive and charming man, Marcus was able to use his looks and personality to attract young girls. It used to be just filing a missing complaint and the matter getting swept under the carpet. It was also Marcus's sheer cunning that never let anyone suspecting him of any crime, let alone murder. He was a man that most did not believe was capable of committing mass murder due to his seemingly normal personality and appearance. Even at his own trial, he maintained the charming and smooth attitude that he had carried right through his violent killing spree. Could you please leave me alone for the moment? I want to listen to my heart beat for the next 60 minutes, for the final hour of my life. It is said that the final wish of a prisoner is fulfilled in his last moment. His lawyer nodded and walked out of the room, giving Marcus his space. 25th July 1977. The newspapers and television news channels had, for the next 4 days, only one headline to run: The killer got the chair. The heinous criminal, the sexual predator, the depraved and notorious murderer was finally electrocuted. Joe picked up the newspaper and read the article on Marcus. A smile of happiness and sorrow ran across his face. He wished he could save her. He wished he could help her out to the best of his ability. A knock on the door startled him. The lady you were treating for bipolar disorder wishes to see you again today evening. Shall I fix the appointment, Dr. Joe?